Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm sure you've had a very long day, but I'm sure all of you are bubbling with knowledge. I certainly am. So this is the final talk of the day. So last but not least, I would like to request Dr. Sidra Khan, who's come all the way from the UK, to give us a talk on endocrinology and diabetes. Just to give you some background, Dr. Sidra Khan is a consultant endocrinologist at Northwest Anglia NHS Trust. Apart from practicing full breadth of endocrinology, she has a special interest in endocrinopathies during pregnancy and use of technologies, specifically pump therapy and continuous glucose monitoring devices. She's also involved in medical education, and I would like to welcome her on the stage to give us her talk on her expertise and experience. Please. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sidra Khan. I'm a consultant endocrinologist in Northwest Anglia NHS Trust. So many thanks for inviting me to talk. And I will repeat what Dr. Raza said, that it's like coming home. Thank you, PES. I am an endocrinologist. I graduated from King Edward Medical College, and I have my CCT in England, London mainly, and worked as a consultant in Royal Free Hospital for 1 year before moving to Northwest Anglia NHS Trust, which is in Cambridgeshire. You had a very busy day. It's a full-on lecture, so bear with me. And if you're bored, just stop me. We can have some question and answers then. So endocrinology in pregnancy. So it's not just about the mother who is pregnant, it's the baby as well. So always remember, hormones change. Look at the hormones which placenta produces, from GnRH, CRH, TRH, all types of hypothalamic hormones, and then pituitary hormones, growth factors, which includes inhibin, IGF-1, IGF-2. The pituitary hormones, pituitary-like hormones, which are from syncytial trophoblasts, are HCG, ACTH, HPL, and oxytocin. So there's lots of assay interference. There are quite a few maternal hormones as well, which include prolactin, IGF binding protein. Bear in mind that there's lots of cortisol binding globulin, and there's lots of thyroid binding globulin as well on board. Corpus luteum derived relaxin is produced as well. So lots of hormones which can interfere with all sorts of assays. So when you are diagnosing somebody who is pregnant with an endocrine condition, bear in mind that she's pregnant and she'll have lots of increased cortisol binding globulins and thyroid binding globulins, along with all these pituitary-like hormones. Just a snapshot of that. So HCG, it peaks in the first few weeks, then it suddenly drops, and then the level is maintained. It corresponds to the TSH levels. So that's why in the first 3 weeks, there is lots of assay interference. Then you've got estrogens and progesterone, which are almost parallel. They go up and then they plateau. Progesterone has to go down for the body to be prepared for the labor. Then you've got very important human placental lactogen, which is HPL. And that is what is responsible for all the insulin resistance. So if you see, after 28 weeks, it continues to rise. So that's why we test ladies for GDM, gestational diabetes, at around 28 weeks of pregnancy. So just a hormonal snapshot. HPL, it affects the gluconeogenesis, insulin resistance increases, IGF-1 levels increase, and that's why you don't really test IGF-1 levels when women are pregnant. So how thyroid disease can affect a cycle of a woman? There are changes in cycle length, polycystic ovary syndrome, estrogen and progesterone imbalances, and ovulatory cycles are the result. So it's so much important. All endocrinopathies, they do have a preconception period when we do make all the changes, and that's when you counsel the patients to get pregnant. I will briefly discuss all the endocrine disorders in pregnancy. So they're risk lesions. I've called it lesions because they are all endocrinopathies. So the low risk regions, there's no detectable increased risk of maternal mortality and no or mild increase in morbidity. So the top is pituitary microadenomas, that is microprolactinoma, pituitary insufficiency, hypothyroidism. You might argue with me that Addison's, I've listed it in the low risk group. That is in context of pregnancy. When somebody is pregnant, mostly the steroids levels, they don't change during pregnancy. Then are the benign adrenal adenomas. So most of these conditions, these can be dealt easily and minimum change is required. And most of the situations can be dealt with in the postpartum period. So microprolactinomas, dopamine agonists, they restore 90% of fertility. There's a good safety profile. There's no increase in miscarriages, premature delivery, malformations, or multiple births. That was the biggest misconceptions previously, but now as endocrinologists, we all deal with it and we know dopamine agonist has a good safety profile. Microprolactinoma by definition is less than 10 millimeters. So treatment is mostly discontinued for less than 10 millimeters lesions. When you find out some woman is pregnant, you just stop them. You take them off the cabergoline, bromocriptine, whatever they were using for their microprolactinoma. Aim is mostly to restore the fertility, which you have already achieved. Chance of expansion is very low in these microprolactinomas. It's around 2 to 3%. And triggers for escalation are mostly reduction in visual fields. So all of these women should have a visual field assessment in each trimester. No prolactin levels are required and they should not be done because in pregnant state, the prolactin is already raised. Hypothyroidism. So all endocrinologists, they deal with hypothyroidism during pregnancy. 0.2 to 2.5 is the target preconception in first trimester. So less than 2.5 milliunits per liter is what we are aiming for. Second trimester, it's 0.2 to 3 milliunits. But we do say that less than 2.5, sometimes we just continue that throughout the pregnancy. We check the thyroid functions at booking, 4 weekly up to 12 weeks, and then at 16 and 28 weeks. That's the minimum. You can aim for more if the targets are variable. They must have a thyroid function test 6 weeks postpartum as well. So this is the hormonal profile. So that's what happens. T4 goes up, HCG, it corresponds with, HCG goes up, spikes, and it starts going down around 16 weeks of trimester. So TSH, what happens to TSH? It goes down. So that's why if they have hyperemesis, you'll have undetectable or very low TSH levels. There's lots of assay interference there in the first 3 weeks. Then T4 goes up and then it comes down and then it becomes steady. That's just a normal pregnancy. I'm not talking about any disorder, just a normal pregnancy. Thyroid, look at the thyroid binding globulin. It goes up. So lots of assay interference again, because lots of thyroid is bound to the thyroid binding globulin. So these are the weeks of gestation. First 3 weeks, high HCG, low TSH, up T4, and then it goes down. So levothyroxine, we all know it's completely safe in pregnancy. Preconception in subclinical hypothyroidism, we do use in order to restore, if you remember the figure I presented earlier, that the thyroid function test can affect the cycle of pregnancy. So in order for them to conceive, a target of less than 2.5 is very important. All liothyronine and animal T4s should be converted to levothyroxine preconception. If it's a new diagnosis, we confirm if it is Hashimoto's or not by doing TPO antibodies. There's increased risk of miscarriage if you don't treat that properly. Anemia, antepartum hemorrhage, preeclampsia, low birth weight, and increased preterm delivery and placental abruption. And these are all real scenarios. So you do deal with all these situations antepartum. Child can have cognitive impairment if first trimester targets are not met. So that's why we're very strict in the first trimester and we want to aim for less than 2.5 milliunits per liter. So this is hypothyroidism, prevalence in type 1 diabetes, it's as high as 5 to 8%. So if somebody is coming with type 1, you must test their TSH at least each trimester. 25% of type 1s have risk of postpartum thyroid dysfunction, so don't forget that. Then we move on to the moderate risk lesions. These are the pituitary macroadenomas. It will be top of my list. Diabetes insipidus, acromegaly, gestational hyperthyroidism, if you remember the essay I just showed you, Graves' thyrotoxicosis, MEN. I won't cover MEN because it would be otherwise quite long topic. Hyperparathyroidism, adrenal disease. I will classify Addison's in moderate group rather than mild group. Cushing syndrome, Cons, and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So these are all moderate risk group lesions. If you look at this MRI scan of one of my patients, so it's very obvious macroprolactinoma there, which has suprasellar extension here as well, suprasellar extension. So if you're dealing with this lady, you will have a completely different approach than dealing with a patient who had a less than 10 millimeter lesion. So they have more, as compared to microprolactinoma, they have 20 to 30% risk of expansion. Symptomatic tumor expansion, dopamine agonist can be continued. That should be a decision by one of us who is trained as an endocrinologist. It should be in a multidisciplinary setting. Escalation, when do you escalate these patients? Formal ophthalmology-based visual field assessment. Each trimester should be done. And if it shows any deficits, then you should be referring these patients urgently for MDT assessment. If there's temporal visual loss, MRI without contrast can be performed and further referred to the MDT assessment. We rarely perform surgeries for prolactinomas, but this is one of the scenarios, being pregnant, and if there's lots of tumor expansion, and if there's visual field defects, we can refer them onwards for neurosurgery because minimum dopamine agonist will do in that expanding prolactin level growth and tumor growth. So just a slide, microprolactinoma versus macroprolactinoma. If they have infracellular extension, you can leave them to be dealt with later. But if there is supracellular expansion and they have previously invasive macroprolactinomas, you should continue their dopamine agonist. And these patients can be referred for neurosurgical intervention. Microprolactinomas, mostly in only a situation we can continue dopamine agonist if there's any tumor expansion risk or if there's any visual field loss. Subclinical thyrotoxicosis mostly does not require any treatment unless the patients are symptomatic, and it is not associated with any adverse pregnancy outcomes. There's a condition called transient hyperthyroidism, mostly associated with hyperemesis gravidarum. There's absence of goiter, ophthalmology, and thyrotoxicosis. It normalizes mid-second trimester. Supportive care is the only treatment option. You just reassure the patient, but you must continue to test their TSH every trimester. Gestational transient thyrotoxicosis is purely HCG stimulation of thyroid. It's in the first trimester. It resolves after the first trimester is over. Symptoms of thyrotoxicosis and elevated free T4 can happen, but there's no enlarged thyroid gland, and it resolves on its own by 20 weeks. There's isolated maternal hypothyroxemia. It's a physiological state, and there's no adverse perinatal outcome. It is mostly prevalent in the first half of pregnancy. Most common is the Graves' disease. We all come across Graves' disease. Even stable Graves' disease on thionamide treatment as carbamazole, propylthiouracil can exacerbate during early pregnancy. Patients who are in remission, they can relapse in early pregnancy. Without known disease, de novo first presentation is quite common during early pregnancy. There's lots of exacerbation postpartum as well. So you must continue to monitor all these patients with trimester each trimester, TSH, T4, and clinical features. These are the outcomes. Patients can go into preterm labor. They can have preeclampsia, stillbirth, small for gestational age babies, and mother may have raised TSI or TRAB antibodies, which can lead to neonatal thyrotoxicosis. Carbamezoles and methamezoles. So what do you do with these treatments when patients are pregnant? So carbamezoles are stopped at conception and in the first trimester. The reason being all these effects on the baby, on the fetus. Cutis aplastis, the commonest one. I had a paper published in 2015, which we did study on if the patients were not switched. Only one case was found to be, that was at St. George's. So only one patient, baby was born with cutis aplastis, did not find out the other side effects. There's esophageal atresia, methimazole, embryopathy. So that's why we just stopped carbamazole as preconception and in the first trimester. PTU is the mainstay in first trimester and preconception, but you must monitor patients' liver function tests because there's a markedly increased risk of hepatotoxicity. Renal tract abnormalities are reported with PTU, but they are very, very rare, extremely rare. The next one is what to avoid when patients are planning for pregnancy or if they are pregnant. Radioiodine is avoided in first 6 months preconception. So if somebody is trying for pregnancy, they should not receive radioiodine treatment. Surgery, if somebody with Graves' disease wants surgeries, must be done preconception. So you need to counsel the patients, have the surgery done before you conceive. So that is only an advice. You can't really ensure that it happens, but that is the advice. Block and replace treatment is contraindicated. We still use it in UK, but pregnancy is one of the contraindications. And for that reason, we do not use block and replace treatment in young childbearing age ladies. Because antithyroid medications cross placenta, but levothyroxine it does not cross, and it crosses minimal. Fetal thyrotoxicosis is a condition. That is why we do thyroid receptor antibodies, and thyroid receptor antibodies can cross the placenta. It's very transient. TRABs are measured in the first trimester and 22 to 28 weeks gestational age. Serial growth scans are done. If a woman has a very high titer of TRAB antibodies, we can give them PTU, and it is adjusted according to the fetal heart rate. So obstetric input is mandatory in these situations. Cord blood can be used to check thyroid functions and to plan the delivery accordingly. Then I will skip that slide. I will go to hyperparathyroidism, which is quite an important entity we deal as an endocrinologist. This is somebody who had a parathyroid adenoma, which is quite, it's around 0.6 to 0.4 centimeter. And that is the only modality we can use when somebody is pregnant. Nuclear medicine scans are mostly contraindicated. So it's 8 out of 100,000 pregnancies, and it's not that uncommon. So I had a patient who recently presented with pancreatitis and hypercalcemic crisis in a pregnant state, who subsequently underwent parathyroidectomy in the second trimester, but they can present with confusion, renal stones, and all sorts of complications. Miscarriage can happen. Neonatal death is not uncommon if it's not treated appropriately. Neonatal tetany is common, and fetal morbidity is around 40% when maternal calcium is 3.5 or above. You can test serum calcium, urine calcium, and PTH. Ultrasound can only be used to localize, and surgery, if you want to do it, it should be MDT approach. The neck surgeons should be there, and radiologists can confidently say it is a parathyroid adenoma, and second trimester you can perform the surgery. Acromegaly. Acromegaly is not that commonly. I have come across acromegaly and pregnancy because they mostly undergo surgery as soon as the diagnosis is done, especially if they show their preference to conceive in the next few months or so. But subfertility can happen due to hyperprolactinemia, secondary to the stalk effect. Confirmation will need to wait if it's a first diagnosis, as IGF-1 levels are quite high, even in the normal pregnancy. There's increased risk of GDM, a PIH, and cardiac conditions can manifest, like heart failure, which can be confused with peripartum heart failure. Long-acting somatostatin analogs should be switched to the short-acting preconception. And if you can't do that, as soon as you find out they're pregnant, you just switch their long-acting somatostatin analogs to the short-acting ones. Tumor growth and apoplexy can occur, although not much evidence. And I haven't really come across any patients who have been pregnant with acromegaly. Either they are treated or they give the preference that they want to conceive and we treat them accordingly. But rarely we come across the patients who become pregnant just after the diagnosis. But you just switch their long-acting somatostatin analogs to the short-acting. If they're already diagnosed, you can refer them for surgery in the second trimester. If they are, you cannot really diagnose them when they are pregnant because of the assay interferences. Use of drugs only to control tumor expansion. You can use dopamine agonist, and you can use pegvisomab and growth hormone receptor ligands. They all can cross placenta. So preconception management is quite important. You see half of this graph, more than half is preconception management. And then management during pregnancy is just what I said, that you can reintroduce medications and you can consider transfusion surgery in the second trimester. Preconception, if they have paracellular disease or microadenoma, paracellular, mostly you deal with the medications. It can be somatostatin analogs, dopamine agonists, or growth hormone receptor antagonists like pegvisomab. Then you have adrenal insufficiency. There are two groups. One is patient who is known to have adrenal insufficiency, and the one is with new onset of adrenal insufficiency. So known adrenal insufficiency, most patients do not need any change in their hydrocortisone or prednisolone levels because not much in the normal pregnancy is needed, not much increase in the dose. Some people will say that some may need 25% increase in the hydrocortisone. But when they have application of stress dose applies when we are planning for delivery. So at induction of labor, at spinal anesthetic or whatever anesthetic you're using, you give them induction dose of 100 milligrams of hydrocortisone. Then you do just stepwise reduction of supplementation to pre-pregnancy doses. Some people will have just increase in the 25% increase in hydrocortisone doses. If it's a new diagnosis, you cannot perform short Sunactin test with reliability. You have to retest after their delivery because of the assay interference. You just start them on steroids if it's a strong clinical suspicion, and you continue that throughout the pregnancy, and application of stress dose applies during delivery and lactation. But when somebody is lactating, you can stepwise reduce the doses to pre-pregnancy doses or physiological doses. How do you diagnose if you can't do a short Sunactin test during pregnancy? Hyponatremia of greater magnitude, weight loss, hyperpigmentation, these all are the common features. Some people will need increase in 25%, as I already mentioned, in the first trimester only, but we try to maintain a very physiological dose of hydrocortisone replacement because of increased risk of gestational diabetes, increased risk of preterm labor. So we try to be physiological as much as possible. Sick day rules apply, and stress dose at induction 50 to 100 milligram IV 6 hourly till the patient eating and drinking. So this is just a graph from British Endocrine Society. So the top part is pregnancy, and you just give them. So British Endocrine Society now says that you must give them hydrocortisone infusion whenever you're dealing with a crisis situation in pregnancy or otherwise. So it's a hydrocortisone infusion, or you can use IV or intramuscularly every 6 hours if that's not an option. Cushing's. This is one of the patients who presented. This is the typical striae of Cushing's. So these are purple striae. This is a large Cushing adenoma. So this is a large adrenal adenoma, heterogeneous and typical of Cushing's. must be differentiated from pheochromocytoma because only on radiological basis undiagnosed Cushing's. Again, a big dilemma when you're diagnosing somebody with Cushing's when they're pregnant. These clinical signs are hallmark of Cushing's when they're pregnant. Mostly they're white stria, but if they're purple stria, along with signs of proximal myopathy, high androgens, hirsutism while they're pregnant, or osteopenia, it can raise the possibility of Cushing's, but it's not hallmark. Hypertension is there in 48% of patients. Preeclampsia is there in 9% of patients. Preterm delivery is there in 43% of patients. So quite high morbidity and mortality when somebody has a Cushing's, which is undiagnosed and they just progress on to labor. Stillbirth, 6%. I think that's quite high incidence of stillbirth. Neonatal adrenal insufficiency is quite common if somebody is undiagnosed with Cushing's throughout the pregnancy. And even if they are diagnosed and treated, it's still quite high. MRI without contrast can be done when they are pregnant. Surgery can be done in first or second trimester. If they're diagnosed during the third trimester, it can be delayed postpartum. So that's just a flow chart. Mostly you rely on signs and symptoms. First or second trimester, you can use urinary free cortisol, and you can use midnight salivary cortisol. But late second or third trimester, you can only use free cortisol if it is greater than threefold compared to the normal level. Cushing's is confirmed, then you go to the ACTH levels. If they are quite high, it's ectopic ACTH production. Less than 2.2, you do proceed to do the ultrasound or MRI without contrast. There's evidence of adrenal mass, you proceed to do laparoscopic adrenalectomy. If the ACTH is greater than 2.2, what do you do when they are pregnant? You can do a high dose dexamethasone suppression test. Less than 80%, you must continue to investigate Cushing's. Cons is quite underreported in pregnancy. The reason being they're mostly not diagnosed, undiagnosed, or they're diagnosed quite late. There's elevated aldosterone and suppressed renin, so you can still do these tests. Hypokalemia is another. So it's just a normal diagnosis as somebody who's not pregnant. So there's minimal assay interference. So they mimic the preeclampsia because they're hypertensive with cons. Rarely they need surgery during the pregnancy. But laparoscopic adrenalectomy you can plan in the second trimester safely. All spironolactones and similar agents should be discontinued when you find out somebody is pregnant. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia, I will only touch how you deal with when you find out there's a female fetus. So these are the gestational weeks. So you give dexamethasone to mother, 20 micrograms per kilogram. Maximum is 1.5 milligrams per day. Chorionic villus sampling will determine whether the fetus is carrying CAH gene or not. It can be confirmed with amniocentesis, and you can do genotyping. I know there are so many limitations in Pakistan, but at least you give them dexamethasone if the mother has confirmed CAH gene. If it's a male fetus or normal female, around 20 weeks of gestation, you stop the dexamethasone. If it's affected female, you continue to give them dexamethasone till term. So male and normal female, after CVS or amniocentesis, you stop dex. If affected female, you continue to term. So 21-hydroxylase is 90% prevalent and 11-hydroxylase is 11%. High chances of miscarriage, PIH, GDM, and growth retardation if not treated properly. Salt wasting in 21-hydroxylase, these 90% cohort is quite common. All sick day rules apply, which apply to Addison's. How do you deal with diabetes insipidus when somebody is pregnant? So what diabetes insipidus do? It can trigger hyponatremia. So you have to maintain the fluid balance quite strictly. Placental vasopressin production and associated ADH reduction is the main dilemma we face during pregnancy. Transient diabetes insipidus resolves 6 weeks postpartum. Mostly what transient diabetes insipidus tells when somebody is pregnant, it tells you that there might be acute fatty liver going on. So that's why somebody develops sudden onset hypernatremia and DI when somebody is pregnant. DDAVP can be continued and it must be continued. There's reduced oxytocin production and monitoring of you have to monitor the ladies of uterine atoning because of it's all pituitary function. So the ADH and oxytocin are both functions of pituitary, posterior pituitary gland. So they can have trouble with lactation postpartum. The high risk is mostly just the pheochromocytoma. I'm not going to discuss MEN, otherwise it can be quite long. So pheochromocytoma, it's quite evident. It's a lady who was 18 weeks pregnant, 30 years old, and a heterogeneous mass on MRI. So why it was done? Because patient had a hypertensive crisis, and she had a history of panic attacks and paroxysmal headaches, but it was diagnosed during pregnancy. It's an endocrinologist's nightmare when somebody has a pheochromocytoma and they become pregnant. Why? Because there is a high maternal mortality, up to 50%. It's quite high. Fetal mortality can be 26%. And even if they have diagnosed pheochromocytoma pre-pregnancy, the fetal mortality can be as high as 11%. Women can go into CCF, PIH, and GDM. Absence of proteinuria, orthostasis, and paroxysmal hypertension can differentiate between pheo and normal hypertension of pregnancy. We can plan a cesarean section to avoid surge and catecholamine. So that's the only way, that's very logical to plan a cesarean section. Oxazocin is mostly preferred, but phenoxybenzamine can be used. So I conclude that hormones are complex, that too in pregnancy. Physiology is quite complex. Interference of acids should be kept in mind. Diagnostic dilemmas of new endocrine presentations are there and they can be missed. And it's not uncommon for them to be missed. Don't forget, we are dealing with two there, mother and the fetus. There should be MDT approach. You should involve the obstetrician and the radiologist for proper scans. So, I mean, I can go on, but I will, if you invite me again, I discuss all the pump patients, how to deal with the pumps and type 1s and type 2s. I will skip that today because it was mainly endocrinology. That ends my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sidra. I would like to request Dr. Aisha Sheikh to kindly come on the stage to present certificate of appreciation to Dr. Sidra. Thank you.